My conversation today is with author, Freemason, Vermont State Representative, and Senior Initiate of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, Kirk White. One of the best words I can use to describe Kirk is accomplished. However, his mundane accomplishments are related to his spiritual achievements. The author of several books on Wiccan spirituality, Kirk is also the founder of the Cherry Hill Seminary. It is an inspiration to see how his spiritual pursuits have expressed themselves tangibly in service to his communities. Kirk and I sat down today to talk about his journey, some of the organizations of which he's a part, systems of spiritual and magical healing, and the spiritual litmus test of material life, plus much more. I'm Ike Baker, and this is the Arcanvm Podcast. I know that you and I have only recently met with one another and started talking, but I'm interested as to how your journey in magic actually began.
That's a great question. I would say I was an odd kid, and so I was always interested in esotericism and other worlds and all that. In third grade, my elementary school teacher made me stay after school on the last day of school and draw on the chalkboard something that did not have otherworldly beings in it, because everything I drew had them. And so I sneaked a little fairy in the tree, but because she wasn't going to beat me down. And so I'd always had an interest. And then and when I turned 11, I had this we joke about this being my Atlantean ancestor, because there was a time in the esoteric world where everyone, of course, was initiated by some secret hidden ancestor of some sort, and so I had an aunt, Norma Monroe of Lebanon, New Hampshire, and she was an eccentric little old lady. And when we would go visit her, she would, when I'm just really little, and she'd like, come over here. She'd say, "This is a pendulum, and you can ask it questions," and just little stuff like that. So
Great.
So I kind of grew up with that. When I turned 11, we didn't see her very often. She lived far enough away that we didn't, but she saw an intermediary aunt. And when I turned 11, she gave my aunt a book, which was called Mastering Witchcraft by Paul Usong, and said, "I think Kirk's going to want this." And and that sort of launched me on this magical journey of exploring various kinds of magical systems and esotericism. And part of my thing is that if somebody does a thing, I always ask the question, well, where does that come from? Why did you do it that way? And that has led me to all sorts of interesting places. So if you start with kind of traditional witchcraft, and then into Wicca, and then you're like, well, where did Wicca come from? And then, well, that's going to take you to the Golden Dawn. That's going to take you to Freemasonry. That's going to take you to Ross Nichols' branch of esoteric druidry. And then you can't stop there. You just have to keep going. And so that's led me to a wide variety of esoteric places.
That's great. And I mean, I don't know how much you want to go into about it, but when did you join the Golden Dawn? When did you get involved in that? I'm just curious.
And of course, I had the doorstop edition for years, but I didn't of Ray Carty's The Golden Dawn, and but I didn't formally join until I think it was either 94 or 96, and.
Wow.
At that point, the nearest temple was Maria Babwa Singh's temple in beautiful Bayonne, New Jersey.
Yeah.
And so it's about a 5-hour drive each way from where I live, but yeah, if it's something you want to do, you find a way to make it happen.
Absolutely. And sometimes, I mean, sometimes it finds you. That was the case for me. I was up in the New York Temple for several years. Yeah. Now I'm down in the North Carolina one.
Yeah.
It was happenstantial, really. It was pretty crazy. And I remember thinking to myself, magic? These people think they're doing magic? Like, what the hell's going on over here? I was able to, there was a pull, there was a draw that just kept bringing me back despite myself, that I was able to suspend my quote unquote disbelief for a while, and it changed my life. So,
yeah.
One of the things that I thought was really interesting when I was learning about you, and your background, is that you founded the Cherry Hill Seminary, which is a leading provider in education and training for ministry and pagan spirituality. That's pretty incredible to me. Had you had any experience in, say, like a small O Orthodox seminary previously? What inspired the undertaking, really?
Well, I mean, it was inspired by this, actually, within the neo-pagan world. A lot of the organizations were just barely, getting legal recognition. and so people were now clergy, and their little church would get their 501c3, boom, I'm clergy. And they what I found was that they actually had no training in that. They belonged to a group that gave them magical training, gave them, spiritual training, but didn't actually train them in the necessary skills of pastoral counseling, and chaplaincy, and all those other important pieces that interface with the dominant culture. And so they would do things that were they were as I used to say, learning on the job is not really an acceptable solution to this thing. And so I discussed it with some friends. We debated this thing for quite a while. Part of the problem is especially within the neo-pagan world, is that people really don't want you to tell them what their theology is. And so how do you have a seminary with that? And ultimately, the solution I came up with was that I define that there's priesthood and or priestesshood and ministry. And the priesthood is what your God or gods call you to do to honor them. And so that's what, that's whatever rituals, ceremonies, however they want that done. And that my belief is that we don't need to get involved in that as long as you have a well-articulated theology. What a seminary can do is teach the ministry skills, and ministry is just a set of administration skills and pastoral counseling and interfaith work and all those kinds of other things that are a way to serve your God or gods, but does not have to be the only way. And the analogy I use is some people they're called by their gods to perform ritual music, and that person probably went and then took a music lesson or two on their instrument and chose to serve their god or gods through learning more about it so they'd be better at to do it. And that we needed that in the ministry skills in the pagan world. So Cherry Hill Seminary was set up with that, that it was just taught ministry skills. It did not teach theology.
So was there any kind of sacramental component? Because you can be orthoprax without being orthodox. So yeah. I'm curious about that.
They were expected to come in with their their own orthodox. And so yeah, that way, people who are, whatever they're, Greek Reconstructionists could come in, and and also they could be in class with Wiccans and Celtic Reconstructionists and various Northern traditions, whatever people's traditions were, and we didn't teach we didn't teach orthodoxy. We didn't even teach liturgical skills, any of that stuff. You're expected to get that in your faith tradition, whatever that is. And I hate using the word faith tradition because that implies that religion has something to do with belief. And I have a whole little lecture on difference between orthopraxy and orthodoxy, because you can be orthopraxic and not actually be dogmatic. So,
yeah, I mean, I belong to I'm a clergy member of a church. I would say that it's much more of a like Valentinian Gnostic. So there's a Christian component there, but yeah, we're not Orthodox, but we do the sacraments. We've done baptisms, we do mass and things like that. So it is an incredible intersection. I spoke actually a couple of weeks ago with Irene Glass up in Maryland.
Yeah.
And she's a professional sort of in the spiritual pagan spiritual communities, and it's just interesting. Do you think that devotional, or I want to say like sacerdotal role, is something that drives people like us, or is it one expression of like the larger, really ancient, right, embedded religious sort of impulse in us?
I think more of it's I think there's more of a religious impulse. The sacerdotal approach, I think, is based around again sort of theologies that include those kinds of things. I walk this interesting line because on the one hand I am I belong to and adhere to and practice a number of modern paganisms, but I'm also a bishop in the independent sacramental movement, and I went through that whole sacerdotal training for that tradition, and so I value them both, and see the use in both.
Yeah, and it's so cool, really, because what I see exemplified, I'm not like, like waving the team flag over here, like go Golden Dawn, but it's in my experience, which has been probably just under a decade now, especially with what's happened by way of maybe in the last, I want to say 5 years, where occultism, magic, all this stuff is exploding. There is a little bit of bifurcation, between the kind of intellectual academics, things like that, and then even people who aren't professional academics, but who take that tack. It's a very Freemasonic kind of approach to everything. And then there's Wiccans, pagans, things like that, very practical. But I find embodied in all of the long time Golden Dawn magicians that I know, this beautiful intersection, really walking that middle path between both of them. And I think something like what you're doing there is a really good example of that.
Yeah. And that is, I think that's I won't make judgments on other traditions, but I do feel like there's value in being able to walk both sides of that, and at least there's been value to me.
Yeah, and you've been able to contribute to, I guess, larger communities. That's something that I find attractive, very much so in paganism. There seems to be a real precedent for that kind of actual getting together, doing work, whether it's group ritual or things like community service, particularly in paganism, which is you can kind of go out there and make a difference. And right, I mean, I enjoy the academic forum that the internet has given us and things like that as well. But to the point that we just made, it's really nice to be able to also get out there and work in the world. And I do find that in pagan community, or I'll say this, more practice focused communities, those kinds of communities, whether they be, because there are Masonic lodges that are very, very ritual oriented, charity oriented.
Yeah. I think, it's one of the things I appreciate about Freemasonry and its relationship in that is that, it holds room for those people who really just want to be scholarly, want to be, intellectual, just want it to be a head exercise, or for that other side of people who really want that to be an initiatic experience, where they really want to have an ineffable experience of the divine, and both of those are available. Both of those are, and you don't have to choose one or the other. People do tend to, I think, gravitate toward one or the other, but they're all available, and I feel like, as you said, that bifurcation exists in a number of realms, including the pagans, right? The Reconstructionists tend to be a little more on the heady side, we can't certainly have any unverified personal gnosis to get into our ritual, but on the other hand, and then on the other hand, you have people who are just, they talk to a spirit, it told them a wacky thing, and sometimes you say, that isn't based in any kind of historical reality at all. But if you're getting something out of it, if it's giving you a context, improving your life, making you be a better contributor to society, again, who am I to judge that?
Great point. And to kind of piggyback off of that, you're definitely a Freemason. I know that much, like myself, brethren of the craft here. But in what other ways do you find your work with Freemasonry sort of dovetailing with your activities in the, I guess, broader communities of magic and occultism or paganism?
That's a good question. I mean, I feel like in a lot of ways, Masonry gives me that, just sort of a foundation, I think. I mean, the reason why I got in Freemasonry, you want to know why I got in Freemasonry? Was I was aware that within it, there was, certainly as I had been studying all these other traditions, and it was a large root of theirs. And so I wanted to go back and experience that root. But also, I was aware that there was a trove of knowledge, information, and stuff like that was available, that it was hard to access unless you were a member of the fraternity. And so I wanted to have access to that, and I also wanted to be with a set of people that had common interests, and I certainly have done that. Again, I do tend to, I like the academic side of Freemasonry, but my heart is always with the initiatic piece of it, and so that then informs everything else I think I do. So in the various spiritual traditions that I participate in, it's always walking that balance between it not all just being a mental exercise. You have to have some experience. I thing I talk about a lot in various communities I participate in is Ken Wilber's distinction between translation and transformation. You familiar with this?
That's a great point.
Yeah, that translation is that you someone I give you a piece of information and you translate it into what you already know, so that you can fit it into your personal filing system of how the world works. And 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 so that's just what it is now. You've added some information. Transformation is when you receive an experience or a set of information that does not fit into your filing system. And in fact, it so doesn't fit into it that you have to that your filing system falls apart and you have to rebuild an entire new conception of reality. And that's how transformation happens. And it always feels like death. If it doesn't feel like death, you didn't go through a transformation.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, I remember that was essentially what turned the tide of my, as I mentioned earlier, quote unquote, disbelief, was the transformation. Like, okay, I have to rewrite the entire interface now because this contradicts the baseline of everything that I was operating under. It's a super important point, because I'm prepared to say that, at least for myself, I think that's the purpose of initiatic stuff. I truly do. So one thing that also obviously that dovetails with your work in Freemasonry and magic, and what we're talking about here is, I believe, are you a member of SRICF?
I am. I'm a chief adept of the Vermont College.
Wow, that's great. That's awesome. Very, very, I would say, particularly by young esoteric Masons coming up with an interest in that stuff. Once they get wind of the SRICF, they're super, super interested. But it's not necessarily the easiest thing, because it's an invitational body. It's not the easiest thing to get involved in. You have to kind of show your that you're not a flake. You have to stick with the fraternity for a while and chip in. But and obviously there are aspects. It's no secret anymore. The HOGD, or the Golden Dawn, as it started, had a very or took on a Rosy Chrisian flavor. Yep. But I recall something that Melita Denning and Osborne Phillips wrote, and I think it was Foundations of High Magic. They made this hardline distinction between the Rosicrucian current and the Ogdoadic current. So I see that, I see that distinction less and less now. But I'm kind of working on right now an episode on Freemasonry and things like that. And what I've seen is that the history is sort of these two threads that are interwoven. Part of it's legendary and part of it is factual, and it's really one cord. And I'm not sure we'll ever be able to untangle those. I don't even think it would be beneficial at this point. But what are your thoughts regarding the Rosicrucian influence of Masonry? That's something, a lot of debate, but I'm interested to hear what your thoughts are.
Yeah. I mean, as you said, I don't know if we will ever fully understand the historical links and lack thereof in places between the two organizations. I think it's been long enough now that there's a strong sort of common sets of beliefs and thoughts. So yeah, I think it's there, or it can be there. I don't know if it was always there. I think some people have put it there in the Masonic tradition, and so I think it's a good current within the Masonic tradition. I don't think it's I don't know if it's a critical, like, I don't think every Mason has to have a Rosicrucian impetus to them, but I think certainly those who tend to be more esoterically inclined are likely to be. So yeah, I certainly appreciate it, but I totally get those brothers that don't. So
yeah, it's pretty interesting because the more esoterically minded Masons back in, I guess what you would call the formative years of modern Masonry over at, even before the Premier Grand Lodge, right?
Yeah.
You had Elias Ashmole and Robert Moray, and those guys were very, very into this stuff. It seems like you were saying they kind of imported the Rosicrucian stuff into what was going on. Yeah. But so we're full circle now.
Yeah. It's fine. It's fine.
So the big question I guess I have, I'm really interested because I understand that you've been a practitioner and for decades, and you're very well practiced and established. And obviously we're talking about all this breadth of experience, right? Freemasonry, Rosicrucianism, Golden Dawn, paganism, clerical stuff. I'm interested in how people like you view what has happened recently in the, magical and adjacent communities. And how have you seen them really change over the past several years?
That's a good question. I think that in a number of those communities, to belong to any of those, whether it was to join the Masons or to become a Rosicrucian or join the Golden Dawn, or even a number of those early pagan groups that were rebirthed in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, they, and even later, they all originally started out as essentially very closed, organizations where it was hard to join them, and it was hard to get any of that information, and and so they were all, in a way, they were all kinds of, you could almost think of them, they were almost kinds of religious orders. And even the ones that don't really consider themselves that, but certainly with the internet and the broader exchange of information, I think you see it used to be a lot fewer people who took it very, very seriously, and now you have more access for people, and there's something good about that. And I really, this is where I don't get evangelical very often, but my preachy side is that I feel like Freemasonry in particular, but a number of these other organizations actually are the solution to a lot of our problems in society these days, because they teach tolerance and and civility and all those things. But so I think it's good that it's able to disseminate to a broader audience. I think that it does mean that there are both more people getting into the deeper side than there used to be, but I also think there are more people who are not joining it for the reasons that we wish they were. People setting up their own scams, in some cases, and so I think everything, like every change, it has its opportunities and its challenges, and we just move forward. I've never been one of those people who said, it was better back in the day. Every day is its own day, and we adapt, we develop, we move, and it is what it is.
Yeah, I think that's a really good and healthy outlook, because no matter what happens, you can't go back. Yeah. I mean, I'm a big fan of the TO movement in Masonry right now, the traditional observance kind of. Yeah. But I understand.
Master of a TO Lodge.
What's that? You were?
I'm a past master of a TO Lodge that we founded here in Vermont. Yeah.
That's fantastic. I'm just now getting involved in the TO stuff out here in North Carolina, actually. But a lot of my friends throughout the states are involved in TO, and a lot of great work to be done there. But obviously, you can't go back. But what I'm finding is that that return to sort of solemnity and seriousness, it really cultivates a space for serious discourse. I think I really truly agree with you, that sentiment, where things like Freemasonry are really, they're being vilified, but it's kind of the medicine, in a lot of ways.
I feel like, we are in a place where a lot of people that, as 100 years ago, sadly, if you look at the events of 100 years ago and you look at the events of today, you'll see some unpleasant parallels. And so at that, but, sort of fin de siècle kind of anxieties that rose up, and then of course society didn't die when the calendar changed, but then there's this free floating anxiety amongst people and uncertainty of how it's going to work out, and then that turns into various kinds of extremism and pieces of society breaking down that weren't. And I think that's part of what drives the impulse to seek more spirituality. And I think that's part of why you see the esoteric orders back in early 1900s and now in the early 2000s, or beginning to first quarter of 2000s, same kind of thing. People are drawn to that. And especially, I think people these days have been raised without a context. A lot of people don't have a spiritual context. They don't have a way of understanding their world. And so there's a strong impulse, I think, especially amongst more contemplative people to want to find that and have a reason and have an understanding of how the universe works and how I fit in it and all that. And so I think it's a good thing.
Definitely a good point to bring to this idea of context, particularly, it's just like I feel like what it seems like anyway is that there's this thing happening in postmodernism where all varying contexts are being funneled to, like, well, no, it's this one thing. And but what I look to sort of, elders in the community, even if it's not people who are actually like, actually older than me, but have been around longer, or have experienced, I mean, a lot of people in there, right by their fruits shall you know them. A lot of people can, or not a lot, but it's when you see it, it, when it's demonstrable that they've really experienced the stuff that you're attempting. Yeah. Those are the people that I go to for advice. So with all your years in both magic and in life, right, you've had a wealth of diversity of experience and influence in your own relative communities. What piece of advice do you think you would give to practitioners maybe starting out today?
I mean, I think that it's important. I mean, to sort of build off from your point, if your spiritual practices, if your whatever you're doing isn't changing and improving you, then I think you need to assess what you're looking at and what your goals are. People who join orders and present me with long lists of accomplishments and degrees and what have you, and they aren't functional in their daily life, cause me to question the efficacy of the things they've been through. That you should notice changes in the person. And if you're noticing changes in the person, as we say in part of the Vermont Masonic ritual, right? The design of the Masonic institution is make its votaries wiser, better, and consequently happier. And that piece goes on to discuss a little bit that such people when they band together will naturally seek each other's welfare equally with their own. And so I think that if you're on this spiritual journey and you are developing and growing, then that you're naturally going to want to make the world around you a better place. And if you aren't doing that, if your spiritual path isn't making you a better person and then making you able and willing to make the world a better place, then again, is it just is it just a fantasy?
Cosplay, yeah.
Are you stuck on the 32nd path? Are you in the treasure house of images? Yeah. And if so, perhaps you may want to move along. So you really got to, when people are in my Golden Dawn temple, I don't care if you can take the tests and pass them. I mean, I do care. You have to. But if I don't see the corresponding change in your world, especially when you're doing the elemental grades, if you're in earth grade and you don't straighten out your house car job and physical security stuff, then you haven't passed the earth grade yet.
Yeah, absolutely. And it only gets worse. It only gets harder as you go through those higher subgrades too.
Yeah. Yeah.
You got to really be ready for a load at that point. I think it's really interesting what you kind of pointed out, saying if it doesn't make you willing and able, right, to which again is just a reinforcement of your point by using your own words. But I think it's worth highlighting. It not only should make you willing, it should make you able.
Yeah.
So that's a really good point. I like that quite a bit. So thank you for that. I did want to touch on something that I found pretty interesting. You have training in Chinese medicine. Is that correct?
I do. Yeah.
That's fantastic because I also have a background in Chinese medicine and body work. It's been a big sort of project of mine to, in my own practice, to emphasize what I feel is really a more holistic approach to magic by incorporating what I've learned of Eastern energy work. Do you feel the same? I mean, what's your experience along those lines? Do you keep them kind of separate, or?
Could you restate that? What do you look for?
So I guess one of the things that I find in modern Western magical practice, we dance around it, right? There's all sorts of projection and consecrations and things like that, but it's rarely explicitly referred to. We talk about etheric energy and things like that, but it's not as well formed as obviously the systematic sort of codification that they have in the Eastern canons, going all the way back to the esoteric Taoist stuff, where they're literally saying, I'm charging this talisman with chi. Yeah. Yeah. And so I'm wondering, like, what I try and do is I keep that as a focus when I'm performing ritual and use some of the exercises in Qigong, which you kind of have to take. At least when I was undergoing my training, it was mandatory that I took like 3 years of Qigong. Yeah. So I utilize some of those things, but some practitioners are like, don't mix systems, don't mix East and West. So how do you feel about that?
I mean, it's interesting because, so I'm a licensed acupuncturist, but I've also spent a lot of time kind of studying, Greek humoral medicine, and studying some Vedic stuff, and at a certain level, I mean, I think people can get confused and hung up on well, is it 4 elements or 5 elements, or is it 4 elements and spirit, which is 5 elements? But so does that make wind the same as ether? And they get themselves, in these convoluted problems. But I think that if you really take and you go back to really, classical era, somewhat into medieval, but Western elemental systems, you'll find that there is still a lot of the same stuff we see in Chinese medicine. And so, especially if you get into like astrological medicine, those kind of things. I mean, if you're not trying to overlay the elements but instead you look at what they call the Sheng and Ko cycle, right? In Eastern medicine, where the promoting cycle and the controlling cycle, right, those still exist in the 4 elements.
Oh, wow.
Right, because earth and air are controlling, fire and water are controlling, right? And right, earth is going to feed the fire that's going to create the updraft of the wind, which is going to create the clouds, which is going to create the water that's going to feed your water. So you have that cycle is still there.
Yeah.
Especially if you take the piece from the Chinese medicine, where Chinese medicine doesn't have spirit,
right, as
a separate thing. It is embedded in the elements. It is assumed the elements are just spirit acting in a particular way, chi, right? And so if you go back and you take out the whole quintessence piece and the whole, out of Greek medicine, and you just go back to the 4 elements, and you acknowledge that the 4 elements are the energy. They are spirit, and they're just manifesting in those ways. You take that out, and the systems actually are very compatible at that point.
That is a wonderful insight. Actually, that's gonna help me quite a bit. So.
I think you just have to get past the exterior presentations, and some of that's cultural. But once you look beyond that and you look at the foundational pieces, and especially the West did weird things, with their, because they had to add the quintessence, and then, and if you compare that into classical, into medical astrology, and then that was made sense until we confused the energy of the spheres with the rocks in the sky, and so when we start thinking of that the planet is what was influencing you, rather than the spirit of God is influencing the planet, and the planet is just a big indicator of what the spirit of God is doing here. If you look at it that way, rather than the rocks, then the number of rocks in the sky are less important, and you don't have to add in Neptune, Uranus, and Pluto and screw up the entire astrological system.
That's an excellent point. That's a great point. Yeah, I mean, and that right there is the spiritual hierarchies coming from the most rarefied divinity down through the intelligences and spirits and things like that. So there's probably fertile ground there, like you're saying, pointing to my thing is that I was going back to the astrological sort of magic and looking at the alchemical stuff, which is as my friend Phoenix Aurelius puts it, he called it a fever dream forest, trying to parse that stuff. It's more complicated, but I hadn't thought to look at like Greek humoral medicine yet. So that's pretty cool. Well, I have, I know that you're working on something that kind of dovetails with what we just spoke about. So did you want to talk about this new system or book that you're putting together?
Yeah, I certainly can. I mean, because of my background in all these alternative medical systems, and my interest in the Rosicrucian impulse, and people who take the Rosicrucian vow, part of the traditional Rosicrucian vow was that you heal people, and yet I have yet to actually belong to a Rosicrucian related organization that does any of that, that really teaches any of that or encourages any of that. And so what I have been doing is basically, in my mind, creating the Rosicrucian healing system that the Golden Dawn probably would have evolved at some point if they hadn't gone through the various schisms and stuff. And so taking the pieces that we learn in the Golden Dawn and going back to their classical roots, or however far I have to go back, and extracting the magical and the philosophical systems to create a healing system that makes sense based on the tools and things that you have. So so you're healing people on the at the the Asiya level or Yetzirah or Briatic. You wouldn't do absolute because that's just God. But and so what the ailments in those levels look like? So a Briatic level are almost going to be basically birth defects.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, like working through the four world system, but like you're saying, using the lower three.
Yeah, and so and how do those that not just birth defects but hereditary things, and so how do you work with that, and how does that manifest? How can you recognize the signs and symptoms? What diagnostic tools, you can't call it diagnosis because we're not teaching a medical practitioner. What assessment tools would you use to determine where this problem is on what of the Kabbalistic worlds, what divinatory systems, so how does an elemental fire problem manifest in the body versus a problem that is the 18th path on the tree of life? How are those different? How do those look? Or what about a Sephirotic problem? And breaking it all down into those pieces. And then based on the Golden Dawn system of magic, how can you then apply the tools that we are taught in the Golden Dawn to work on and address those?
Wow, that sounds extremely sophisticated.
I've been working on it for a while, and I'm still working on it.
I'm excited for that, man. Oh, you got to let me know as soon as that's coming down the pipeline. I pre-order that. That's incredible. So I have a canned question that I give every guest, and it usually puts them a little bit on the spot, but most of them are authors. So feel free to recommend your own books. But typically what I ask people at the end of our conversation is, for anybody that's listened to our conversation today, we've touched on a lot, as we do on this channel. We talked about Rosicrucianism. We talked about pagan spirituality. We talked about healing. If you were to condense basically this conversation into 3 book recommendations, what books do you think that you could recommend off the top of your head for people wanting to get started?
Wow. Yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, there's a reason why I write books, and
go ahead. Yeah.
I'm writing them for things I don't think anyone has. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't even know if I have any particular books that I would recommend. I have libraries that I would recommend. I mean, sit down with Agrippa and 3 books of occult philosophy and memorize that, and take Christopher Warnock's Renaissance astrology classes, and any number of other kind of astrological pieces. Do whatever esoteric system you have, and I think that's an important piece. I think they will all, at some level, get you somewhere, and probably somewhere good. But the trick really is just to do them. Don't just be an armchair occultist. You have to get out there and do the rituals, do the practices. I don't know a lot. I know a little about alchemy. You learn a little bit of it in the Golden Dawn and other places. But I haven't taken it much further than sort of basic vegetable processes, operations, and but I didn't want to be someone who read about in the Rosicrucian work or the Golden Dawn about alchemy and would know a few words and actually hadn't ever made salts. And so so do it. And then again, I feel like you have to find ways to embody it in you and in your life. It's less about the books and more about what's in you. So you do it, you do the work, and you do the work because of the work. You don't do it because people are going to give you a fancy new jewel to wear on your tuxedo or whatever it is. You just do the work. I'm a big fan of reading all the classics, I suppose.
Yeah, can't go wrong. That's a great answer. I very much appreciate you coming on and spending a little bit of your weekend with me. It's been a real pleasure to speak with you and to get to know you a little better. And I'm looking forward to everything that you produce in the future. And I certainly hope that we speak again. Thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.